Katie, and this is the 14th episode of Ornamentations, which will be a look at my very big whip, and we will be returning to the wonderful world of historic embroidered caskets, which for those new to my channel is the archaic term for these elaborate embroidered boxes that were worked in 17th century England by schoolgirls. An interesting fact about caskets is that they were, for those who worked them, not every girl did, the final stage in their needlework education, and they followed the sampler. Not every girl who stitched a sampler went on to stitch a casket, but for those who did, the casket was the immediate next step. The sampler was what they stitched in order to prepare for their stitching on this kind of elaborate embroidered box. Interesting historical footnote. And caskets were cohesive objects. So these aren't just a series of pretty embroidered pictures. They work together to tell a story. And usually that was a story from antiquity. The casket that inspired the panel I'll be showing you today told the story of the Judgment of Paris, or a biblical story, or a series of allegories around an organizing theme. So this casket tells the story of Joseph, and another wonderful embroidered casket in the collection of the Met tells the story of Esther. That's the lid of that one, and then these are the sides. So in thinking about designing my own piece, I knew that I wanted to keep that aspect of it, of a object that told a complete story. And in looking to where I was going to find my story, I turned to literature, as that's really my true passion, other than stitching. I mean, mostly stitching, but also literature. So when those two can go together, happiness. And the story I decided on for this casket that I'm working on and showing you today is the story of Britomart, the female knight from Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Fairy Queen. And Britomart's story in the poem is going from a princess of Britain to an all-conquering female knight. And my casket panels depict her journey. And the lid, which is what we're looking at today, this is where it's going to go on the casket right here on the lid, depicts the climax of her story. It is her battle with Radagund, and this is my design for the panel, which shows the two combatants in the moment before the battle in, a setting of greenery, partly because I really like stitching trees and also because they make good filler, and then clouds, the sun, and stars. You shouldn't really have stars on a sunny day, but this is my casket and I get to stitch what I like. So I put a lot of things in just because I wanted to stitch them, especially on this panel, which was a collection of a lot of design elements that I thought were cool. So really I'm not very different from any other stitcher in that regard. So the lid of the casket depicts the moment before the battle. So what's happened here is that Britomart's true love, which is a lot of the focus of the other panels of the casket, has been captured after being defeated in combat by the warrior queen Radagund. And Britomart rides to the rescue, defeats the warrior queen, and frees her true love. And in depicting that moment, you could choose any number of ways to look at it. You could depict combat, you could depict Britomart victorious, but I chose to depict the moment before the battle, where Radagund is standing with her spears and Britomart is approaching her sword in hand. To me, this signifies a very dynamic kind of movement. It's not necessarily the most obvious way to depict Britomart Triumph, but it was what I landed on, and I think it's been pretty successful. So my method of working this is that it's laced up. I do four-sided lacing, so it's laced on all four sides as opposed to stitching it to the twill tape on the roller bars, if you're familiar with a slate frame. On a slate frame. And I work this on a Lowry floor stand, which I can't recommend highly enough. And that's the how. And the what, these are some of the threads that I have already used. This is a really beautiful palette of pale filament silks, all Perlé and Paris. And then these are some of the threads that I'm looking at as I go forward in filling out the panel. So, and there it goes. I can't get through a single video without dropping something, I swear. So, elements for the trees, for the greenery, for the tree trunks, and to finish off Britomart there. When I start working a panel, I do always have a design, but this is like a picture that's not in focus. And as you stitch, as you make decisions about which thread, what technique, as you fill all of these elements in, the picture comes into focus. And looking at your materials is one of the things that I at least find helps me make those decisions and bring the picture into focus. So I said in my last episode that stitching a casket panel, and really stitching a casket, is a lot like stitching in a sampler. And I fully maintain that that's true. There is obviously a significant difference here, which is different kinds of stitches, and that's a big one. But as a friend said to me recently, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. This panel, just like everything hanging on your wall, was worked one stitch at a time. I have moved between motifs, filling them in as I go, abandoning things that were giving me trouble. So the analogy there would be, if you're working on your border and you are just sick of your border, you've had enough of your border. You know, you're not Carol the Saltbox Stitcher who can stitch an entire border in one go, just so disciplined and in awe. But you need a break from your border, and so you move to something that's a little more fun. You fill in a tree or a flower or a bird, and then you return to the border. So here, these are some giant mounds, and I would periodically have to move up to filling in the clouds because I think they're beautiful and I love the colors, or, you know, working a few leaves before I could return to these giant mounds of green. So you really work this one motif at a time, one stitch at a time, and you just keep on putting one stitch after another until you have a complete piece. This is just a little series of building blocks that you build one motif, another motif, and in the end you're looking at a finish. And while this is a complicated panel, it's not necessarily any more complex than some of the very large, very elaborate samplers I've seen out there. This might not be more man hours than some of the Queen of the May Hands Across the Sea samplers. It's just one foot in front of another is how you get there. And yes, I did show you my threads. I can't even keep track of where I am. So this is really just a first look at this panel because there's so much to say about it, and we'll be returning to my progress. I hope to have progress to show you. That would be nice. And talking a little more in detail about some of my choices here, my design choices, my thread choices. But today is just a first look because there really is so much to say about this piece. So this is one of the actually finished motifs here, is this wonderful tree modeled after a tree that's on the Fenton House casket. I'll link a photo in the description. It's a really extraordinary piece. Britta Mart moving towards her enemy is only partially filled in. As you can see, the pink things are the feathers coming out of her helmet. I had to have a few design flourishes and, you know, armors and all that interesting. So she's got big pink feathers coming out of her head. And then I have pink clouds because I wanted to stitch pink clouds. Basically, the joke to myself is that this is the rosy fingered dawn, points to anyone who gets the reference without resorting to Google. And then we have the partially stitched warrior queen here. She's got most of her armor, she's got her hair, but she's missing her spears and her outline. And then of course the tree that divides them, and which is really dominating the negative space here, is currently just a blank. There is quite a lot done on this panel, and it is closer to a finish than it looks right now, but I just have not had the time to fully devote myself to this and make the decisions that I need to make on this. So unfortunately, it's mostly been in timeout. It was started in September 2021, and I had great momentum on this at first, but then I hit some roadblocks and I needed to put this aside, and the Simple Harmony box happened. I've been doing the Marie Antoinette Smalls Christmas stitching, and Britta Mart just hasn't had my full attention, sadly, because I think she is beautiful and that this will be a lovely, lovely panel. I am trying to show you this from different directions so you can see how much the light and the angle of the light can change your perception of the colors. This is one of the defining characteristics of filament silks. So this might not be what you expected looking at these, which are a little more Easter eggy. Silks in particular can really change when they're worked depending on how they're used and how the light is hitting them. So this is Britta Mart's decisive battle with her most challenging enemy, I guess you could say. And that will be ultimately the lid of my casket. So far, I think this is my favorite panel. We'll see how it goes. If I don't finish it out the way I hope I can, it might not be my favorite panel by the time I'm done with it, but fingers crossed that I can bring this one home. I do love the threads that I am thinking about for these, and no, dear, this is just a complete mess. So this is pretty much how I work. I don't have a dedicated stitching space. I sit on the couch with a box top full of crap next to me and my drawing, and I just try and fill it in and hope that I like my choices and I don't have to cut out too much of my stitching, because I definitely do have to frog things. So that is our first look at Britta Mart's decisive battle. I really love that tree. Does anybody else love that tree as much as I do? I am a big fan. And we will return to this again at some point in the future, both to look at progress and to talk about some of my design choices and some of my thread choices. Speaking of thread choices, answers were pretty conclusive in the comments. People do want to see a tutorial on specialty threads. So I will be doing that, although it's probably not going to be immediately. There are still Simple Harmony tutorials to get through, and with people working so diligently on their boxes, please keep your photos coming. I love seeing them. Use the hashtag Simple Harmony SAL on Instagram, or feel free to email me photos directly. It's just awesome. I do want to continue with the Simple Harmony tutorials, so thread tutorial is coming, but not immediately, and that gives me more time to plan and more time for you to tell me what you want to know. Specific suggestions are really, really helpful. So some things that were mentioned that are just so useful for me to know would be what needle to use and how do you choose what needle to use, you know, what is suitable for what count. Specific questions help me give you the information that you want to know, because I have been working almost exclusively with filament threads for many years. So a lot of these things I don't even think about anymore, what needle I'm using. I just pull one out of a piece of felt and go to town on it. So detailed feedback, really, really, really helpful. And please keep that coming. Let me know what you want to know in the comments and we will get to that tutorial. But speaking of Simple Harmony and Simple Harmony tutorials, the most recent tutorial that went up last week is on blocking your embroidery to prepare it for gluing, and I would like to note a couple of things about it. One, if you are a Cabinet of Curiosities casket stitcher watching this, you're not going to block your fabric. You are, I hope, working it fully tensioned on a slate frame or something very similar, in which case you do not unlace this, wet it, and block it. You leave it fully tensioned and laced on your frame, and then you go directly to the next step, which will be the next tutorial, cutting the backing paper, applying glue to it, and then gluing the backing paper to your embroidery. If you are a casket stitcher working at full tension, you do not do the blocking step. That is specific to embroidery where you are cross stitching and using a hoop or Q-snaps or whatever. If you have your fabric fully tensioned on a frame, whether that's cross stitch or anything else, you do not need to block, because the tension you put in your embroidery from the start keeps you from experiencing the distortion, and blocking is done to eliminate distortion. So if you don't have any distortion in your stitching to begin with, you don't need to do the blocking. The thing about this particular kind of work is that you get it at one end or the other. You can either put in the work at the beginning in doing a full lacing job and working under full tension, or you can work in a hoop or in hand and then you have to block at the end to remove the distortion. So you can either prevent distortion by doing a full lacing job, or you can block the distortion out after you've stitched. I generally prefer to just put the work in up front, which is why on any surface embroidery you will always see me stitching with lacing in a frame, whether that's a slate frame or reinforced stretcher bars. But if you stitched in hand, you stitched in a hoop, blocking after the fact is how you remove distortion. And the tutorial is geared towards Simple Harmony, but I'd like to note it's also useful if you are doing your own framing, because a lot of what I see on Instagram and on YouTube hasn't been blocked. So if you're looking at your framing job that you did yourself, obviously if you send it off to Total Framing, they're going to take care of this for you. But an unblocked embroidery, your border may have a little bit of a wobble in it, and that's the distortion. And it's very noticeable because if you think about the structure of a sampler, the border on all four sides is running parallel to your frame. So if these two things aren't perfectly parallel, if one of them's got a little bit of a dip in it, it's that difference between them that is throwing you off. And doing a full blocking job will really improve your framing. So that's a very multi-purpose tutorial. Tension and the need for it is one of my personal hobby horses, so I'm sorry about that. Was a borderline rant, but it is something that's very important and often overlooked. I find it's also one of the easiest ways to improve your stitching. is good tension or good blocking at the end to even out your weave and eliminate any distortion. When you think about it, your stitching is the sum of all parts that go into it. So your chart or your design, your ground fabric, your choice of thread, and your working method, hoop, frame, in hand, and you know whether or not that engenders distortion around later down the line. And your finish is going to be the sum of all of those parts. All of the choices you make along the way are going to be what determines your finished result. And so it's worth paying as much attention to your working methods as it is to your choice of thread. But I'm going to leave off that particular rant and show you my giveaway for this week. I was going through my books. My embroidery shelves are getting awfully full, and I realized that I needed to call. Actually, I've known that for a while, but I didn't want to just give the books to just anybody. However, on Flosstube, you know that they're going to stitchers who will love and appreciate them the way that I do. And so I am going to be periodically giving away some of my own books, ones that were reference guides that I no longer use regularly, things I just love but know I won't stitch and want to pass on, much the way some people pass on charts I know they're never going to stitch. So this giveaway is the RSN guide to silk shading. And silk shading is most of the methods used on this panel, which is why it's my choice for today. If the methods used here intrigue you, this would be a good place to start. I'm not actually a particularly accomplished silk shader. There are people who do much more detailed and intensive work than I do, but good thread choice and good color choice will cover up all your little, you know, kind of blunt force silk shading would be what I call my own. And this is a good basic reference guide and a place to start. So if you would like to win the RSN Stitch Guide to Silk Shading, which is a very start to finish of the methods, the threads, the working materials, it's a good A to Z guide to the basics here, put book in your comment and you will be entered for the giveaway. Worldwide is fine on this one, it's pretty light. So that's my giveaway for today. I hope you enjoyed my first look at Britomart. We will be looking at her again as she evolves, and I'm excited to share my progress with you and how this casket comes together from a prepared box into a fully finished piece is a journey that I hope you will join me for. But it's a long journey, so the next episode will be a feast of finishes because I have several to share with you for next time that I'm really excited to show you. Some cross stitch, some surface embroidery, and I hope you will join me for that. And until next time, happy stitching.